If you want to understand how a civilization really breaks, do not begin with the bodies. Begin with the balance sheet. Begin with a continent that looked powerful on the surface, but was already running thin underneath. A continent where land had been pushed hard, harvests had become less forgiving, and population had grown faster than resilience. A continent that still believed its institutions were permanent. That was Europe on the eve of the Black Death. And here is the part most people miss. The plague did not destroy a healthy system. It exposed a stressed one. It found a medieval economy already vulnerable after years of bad harvests, famine, war, and social strain, then turned those weaknesses into a full-scale civilizational shock. By the end of this story, you will see why the Black Death was not just one of history's deadliest pandemics. It was one of history's most brutal repricings of labor, power, faith, and human life. Picture the scene before the collapse. In the early 14th century, Europe was crowded by medieval standards. Much of the best land had already been taken. Margins were shrinking. Lords demanded dues. Peasants worked narrow strips of land that could barely absorb a bad season. Towns grew, trade routes thickened, and commerce moved faster than medicine or public health ever could. The system looked alive, productive, expanding. But like many systems that seem strong, it was one shock away from panic. Then the shock came from the trade routes themselves. In 1347, ships moving west from the Black Sea carried more than cargo into the Mediterranean. They carried plague. Whether people first understood it as divine punishment, poisoned air, or some nightmare from the edges of the known world, hardly mattered. What mattered was speed. By the time the disease reached Sicily, then ports across Italy, southern France, and the Iberian world, Europe had no real defensive playbook. There were no antibiotics, no germ theory, no functioning epidemiology in the modern sense. There was only fear, improvisation, and a growing realization that this was not a bad season. This was something else. Within months, the disease was inside major commercial arteries, ports infected inland towns. Merchants, carts, households, monasteries, inns, markets, and parish life all became part of the transmission chain. The medieval economy had spent generations building connectivity. Now that same connectivity turned lethal. Trade, which had enriched Europe, began to act like a delivery system for catastrophe. The symptoms were terrifying enough to feel supernatural. Fever, weakness, vomiting, pain, swellings in the groin, armpits, or neck, darkened skin in some victims. In a world with limited medical understanding, the disease seemed to arrive like judgment and kill with the confidence of fate. Some died within days. Some towns lost so many so quickly that the living could not bury the dead in any recognizable rhythm of dignity. And once a society loses its burial rhythm, it starts losing more than bodies. That is when the real collapse begins. Not only demographic collapse, but moral and institutional collapse. Because the Black Death did not simply kill individuals. It shattered routines. It shattered expectations. It shattered trust in the future tense. Chroniclers across Europe describe houses abandoned, workshops emptied, fields left untended, and family members avoiding one another out of terror. Priests died hearing confessions. Physicians died treating patients. Officials died while trying to maintain order. In some places, people fled cities for the countryside. In others, they discovered that distance offered no guarantee. Boccaccio's Florence became one of the era's great symbols of psychic breakdown, a city where ordinary social rules seemed to dissolve under the pressure of mass mortality. And when explanation fails, people reach for extremes. Some turned to prayer. Some turned to indulgence, convinced that if death was close, restraint no longer made sense. Some joined the flagellant movements, public rituals of self-punishment meant to appease divine wrath. And some turned to something even darker: scapegoating. Across parts of Europe, Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells or causing the plague through malice or sorcery. That lie became a license for murder. Pogroms spread through fear-soaked towns that needed someone to blame, because blaming randomness felt unbearable. This is one of the ugliest recurring truths in crisis history. When systems fail, societies do not always become wiser. Often, they become crueler first. The death toll remains debated, but the scale is beyond dispute. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, likely killed somewhere between a third and over half of the continent's population, with some modern estimates pushing the European toll toward 50 to 60%. In some regions, mortality was lower. In others, it was catastrophic. The important point is not the perfect number. The important point is that Europe experienced a demographic shock so severe that for generations it altered inheritance, labor markets, tax systems, military capacity, and the psychology of daily life. This is where financially literate viewers should slow down and pay attention. When half your labor force disappears, you are not looking at a normal recession. You are looking at a civilizational supply shock. Land is still there. Tools are still there. Lords still have legal claims. But the people who make the system run are gone. The old ratio between land and labor breaks overnight. And once that ratio breaks, everything built on it starts to move. Fields went unplowed. Harvests shrank. Entire villages were weakened or abandoned. In some areas, demand for grain fell because there were simply fewer mouths to feed, while labor became radically more expensive because there were far fewer hands to work. Landlords, who had once commanded obedience from a surplus population, now faced a scarcity they could not easily control. Surviving peasants and laborers, for the first time in generations, had leverage. That leverage did not create freedom overnight. Feudalism did not vanish in a single clean break. But the Black Death changed the bargaining position of ordinary workers in ways medieval elites could neither fully accept nor fully reverse. Wages began to rise in many areas. Labor services became harder to enforce. Mobility increased. Tenants negotiated better terms. Land that once gave aristocrats power now became harder to monetize without people to work it. The ruling classes saw the danger immediately. In England, authorities responded with measures like the Statute of Labourers in 1351, an attempt to freeze wages and discipline workers back into pre-plague expectations. That was not just a labour law. It was an act of economic denial. It was the state trying to pretend that the market for labour had not been fundamentally transformed by mass death. But history does not care about nostalgia. Once labour became scarce, workers knew it. Lords knew it. Governments knew it. And tension began to build between the old legal order and the new economic reality. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 did not erupt in a vacuum. It emerged from decades of pressure inside a world the Black Death had already destabilized. This is why the plague matters far beyond medicine. It changed bargaining power. It changed expectations. It changed the price of human effort. It also changed the Church's position in the moral economy of Europe, though not in the simplistic way popular retellings sometimes suggest. The Church did not disappear. and faith did not collapse into secular modernity in one dramatic turn. But the plague damaged confidence in inherited authority. Clergy died in enormous numbers. Prayers did not stop the mortality. Sacred spaces were not spared. For many Europeans, that did not destroy belief. But it did shake the certainty that the existing guardians of truth could explain or manage catastrophe. The wound was intellectual as much as spiritual. And catastrophe did not end neatly in 1351. That is another myth. The Black Death was the great first wave, but plague returned repeatedly in later outbreaks. Europe did not experience one clean trauma followed by recovery. It experienced recurrence. More death in 1361, more in 1369, more in later decades. That matters because recurring plague turned panic into structure. It was not just one appalling memory. It became part of economic planning, inheritance behavior, urban fear, and collective imagination. Over time, the consequences accumulated. In some places, nobles leased out domain lands rather than trying to farm them directly. In others, pasture became more attractive than labor-intensive grain cultivation. Real wages rose for many survivors. Consumption patterns shifted. The surviving population inherited more land, more goods, or more opportunity than they might have expected before the plague. That did not mean medieval Europe became fair. It meant the old arithmetic was broken. This is the deeper story. The Black Death was not only a tragedy. It was a redistribution event, savage and involuntary. It wiped out lives on a scale almost impossible to comprehend, then forced a renegotiation of value between those who owned assets and those whose labor made assets productive. In modern language, dead capital remained abundant, but live labor became scarce, and scarce labor became more expensive. That shift ran through every layer of society. Marriage patterns changed. Women in some regions found new openings in work and property management, though never in a uniform or liberating way. Urban guilds adjusted. Rural hierarchies bent. Governments tried to clamp down. Landlords litigated. Workers moved. Survivors calculated. The continent did not simply mourn. It repriced itself. If this story is changing the way you see history, subscribe now and share this video with one person truly close to you. Someone with whom you want to build wiser, stronger relationships with your children through the stories you pass on. Because history is not just information. It is inheritance. And the stories we hand to the next generation shape how they understand work, fear, power, and human worth. The cultural consequences were just as profound. Art grew more preoccupied with death, judgment, and the fragility of earthly status. The Danse Macabre was not just an artistic theme, it was a civilizational mood. Literature became more intimate with contingency. Boccaccio's Decameron, framed by young people fleeing plague-stricken Florence, was not merely entertainment. It was evidence that storytelling itself had become a survival mechanism, a way of reclaiming human voice from mass death. And yet, we should resist the lazy idea that the Black Death alone caused the Renaissance, capitalism, or modernity, as if history were a simple machine with one lever. That is too neat. What the plague did was more unsettling and more real. It weakened old structures, accelerated existing pressures, and made later transformations easier to imagine, and, in some places, harder to resist. It did not single-handedly invent the modern world. It made the medieval world less stable, less confident, and less able to reproduce itself on the old terms. That is a different claim, and a stronger one. Because in historical markets, as in financial ones, the event that changes everything is not always the event that creates a new system from nothing. Often, it is the event that breaks the old system's illusion of permanence. The Black Death did exactly that. Before the plague, Europe still believed that hierarchy was natural, that scarcity would discipline labor, that the church and the manor and inherited rank formed a durable architecture of life. After the plague, those structures remained, but they no longer felt untouchable. Too many lords had lost income. Too many workers had learned they mattered. Too many families had seen priests, doctors, and magistrates fail beside them. Too many towns had watched commerce become contagion. When a civilization survives something like that, it does not return to innocence. So, no, Europe did not literally vanish under the Black Death. Cathedrals still stood, kingdoms still ruled, trade resumed. Fields were sown again. Children were born into a world that had room for them, because so many others were gone. But something fundamental had collapsed. The confidence that the old order was fixed by God, nature, and custom in a way human beings could never renegotiate. That was the deeper death inside the Black Death. The death of inevitability. And that is why the story still feels modern. Because every age builds systems that look efficient, right up until they reveal how brittle they really are. Every age assumes its institutions can absorb stress until one shock tears through the hidden weak points. Every age discovers, usually too late, that connectivity creates both wealth and contagion. That concentrated power can look stable until it is tested. And that the people considered most replaceable can suddenly become the scarcest resource in the system. The plague of the 1300s did not just empty graves into Europe. It emptied certainty out of it. It forced a continent to relearn the value of labor, the limits of authority, and the price of fragility. It made death visible in every market, every parish, every inheritance dispute, every abandoned field, and every prayer that seemed to go unanswered. It was horror, yes, but it was also disclosure. A revelation of how quickly a civilization's surface confidence can give way when the human beings inside it begin to disappear. In the end, that is the real legacy of the Black Death. Not merely that millions died, though they did. Not merely that Europe suffered, though it did. Its deepest legacy is that it reordered the conversation between wealth and work, between rank and necessity, between faith and explanation, between what a system says it values and what it cannot survive without. And once Europe learned that lesson, however painfully, it could never entirely unlearn it.